Hello and good evening. The news gang is here. The chatter about Chatham, all the talk from Hard Talk interview, and of course the Western confession. Also on the show tonight, Kalonzo's newfound love for watermelons, the fruit that is, and why the cost of polls in Kenya and the rest of the world are poles apart. But let's begin with that Chatham address by Deputy President William Ruto and what he wants changed in the Constitution should that much-awaited referendum take place. Let's listen to part of that speech.
Proper. That the leader of a party garnering the second highest votes has no formal constitutional role. It does not resolve the problem, which is that we need a functional, constitutional, official opposition. Even if the positions were created, it would still be taken by the winning party. With the leader of opposition taking leadership of the opposition in Parliament, the Deputy President should then take over the leadership of government business in Parliament. This should be replicated at the county level by deputy governors.
Very interesting. I'll call them recommendations. Francis, you've been covering this whole issue. Many recommendations being made that even the Building Bridges initiative, people saying things they want changed, and everyone seems to be talking about leader of official opposition. But the DP didn't quite go the Prime Minister way. Quite interesting, isn't it?
One step back, the Building Bridges initiative, they told us they want to hear what we want to say so that they can recommend. But clearly, the people who sent them to come and ask us what they want to hear from us seemed like they had an answer. So the answer was there. What we were looking for is the question. So we were told X plus X is equals to 2. Work backwards. A referendum is imminent. Let's start there. Secondly, every person will make recommendations in a suitable manner. You hear the Deputy President say, retain the presidential system, actually give functions to the Deputy President.
Which functions he doesn't have right now, right?
Article 147 is clear. The Deputy President has no functions except those granted to him by the President. So what he wants is a situation where the next Deputy President will have functions, leader of government business. Currently, those functions are being, or that role is being played by the leader of majority leader in the National Assembly, i.e. Aden Duale in this case. So you will hear those who want an executive prime minister. Of course, they have something in mind. You will hear those saying, retain the presidential system as is. Of course, Deputy President William Ruto being very close to power currently in terms of one step to the presidency, if he will be there, I mean to State House, if he will be there, would have obviously want a situation where he gets to enjoy the presidential powers as currently enjoyed by President Uhuru Kenyatta. So if you tell him about minimizing those powers, he may not be very comfortable with it. And there are those who probably would want that executive expanded a little bit, because you're also looking at, if I don't get the presidency, I can land at the Prime Minister.
And we talk about those other people. William Ruto making interesting statements there, Linus, about how he would like this changed, that the Deputy President, a position he holds now, should have powers that are not merely donated by the President, but that are properly enshrined in the Constitution. Are those things that things we need, so to speak, or is it something that is beyond that, a lot to do with where we are politically and what the DP himself might be looking forward to in the next 2-3 years?
Right. I think the first thing we notice is the change of heart by the Deputy President. In the last year, starting April last year, he has been saying no to this talk about the referendum. As recently as October last year, when he spoke in Kiambu, he said those talking about a referendum are wasting time and they should let he and President Uhuru Kenyatta continue with the development of the country. So there is a change of heart, first of all. And then number two is, by his proposal, which I find very substantive, the shaping up of the referendum issues have formally begun. Now we are starting to see politicians and leaders saying, okay, if we're going to have the referendum, what will it be about? And I think Ruto has led the way by putting a very substantive presentation, which in my view is a return to his position in the Parliamentary Service Commission pre-2010 referendum, when they went to Naivasha. Remember, Ruto at the time, he was at the time the Minister for Agriculture, proposed a very strong presidential system
That's right.
backed by strong regional governments.
Yeah.
And he argued at the time that, look, this draft, which speaks of counties, is too weak to support devolution. And I remember him saying, how can councillors stand up to the president? So he wanted something bigger than that. But then, something bigger than that is what Raila Odinga proposed in the devolution conference last year,
In
April,
Kakamega.
in Kakamega.
About the third tier.
Introduce a third tier.
Yeah.
Don't kill the counties, but introduce a third tier, which sounded like a return to the 60s, what the country was with the 8 big regions.
But there's an interesting thing here. I mean, and I think Francis was alluding to it, that all these people are making substantive propositions with regard to this new constitution, but there's a sense in which one cannot help seeing where people standing depending on where they are sitting, because if you think about it, the deputy president actually said something at his home in Sugoi the other day when he was meeting, I think was it some MCAs and some governors and that sort of thing, where he said, I have no problem with this referendum, but let them not tell us or reduce the number of counties and that sort of thing. So there's a sense in which this is jaundiced by where people find themselves or what political hopes, so to speak, they might have for 2022. But I do think there is a sense in which we are beginning to see the various positions, and you can actually analyze and see where the fault lines might be when, in fact, the real conversation begin about this, Yvonne.
It was interesting that he made these proposals, one, I think, on foreign soil. Like it was, like you said, Linus, a proper, substantive proposal to this. I think it's probably the most substantive that we have heard, you know, from, in structure. Yeah, I mean, you know, it was some thought to it. And to think that this was the heart of his speech at Chatham House. Yes. He didn't talk about anything else. Of course, he talked about the gains of the new constitution, where the faults are. So that is one thing I find interesting. Another thing also is, like you say, the voices that are loudest in whether there will be a referendum are all of these politicians and political leaders, to the extent that I wonder to what, you know, it sort of influences what ordinary Mwananchi will say when they go before the Building Bridges initiative. I mean, and that is what is interesting for me. But to go back to the Building Bridges, like you said, these are the people who are talking loudest. Are we ever going to talk about the analysis of devolution, the structure of government? Because right now, we're so focused on the role of the executive, which is fine. And it's interesting that we're talking about possibly proposals to expand it when the president says we have no money and we cannot pay nurses. But we're talking about having a referendum between now and 2022. Sorry, I just had to throw that in. But let me just talk about the Building Bridges initiative. All of the things they talked about: ethnic antagonism and competition, lack of a national ethos, inclusivity, divisive elections, which is something I guess we will talk about, safety and security, shared prosperity. None of these issues seem to be making it to the fore. Instead, we remain, as always, focused on the nature of the executive.
Jamila, as you jump in, is it now evident that it is a question of when rather than if with this referendum thing? Because everybody seems to be saying when we have the referendum, we need to do ABCD.
Yeah, and Francis alluded to it, and he said it's an X plus X is equal to 2. Let's find X. This is something that's going to happen very soon, if not this year, maybe next year. And Yvonne has spoken about cost. And I look at some statistics here about, remember, we also want to do a census. Tunataka kuhesabu watu mwaka huu. And that is supposed to cost us over 18 billion shillings, 18.5 billion if I'm not mistaken. Now, the only referendum we can refer to is the one that happened in August 2010. And at that time, it cost the country 10 billion shillings. And then the 2005 one, in which the question of approving the constitution was defeated, cost over 13 billion shillings. So there are some experts who are estimating that if we do go into a referendum right now, it's going to cost us about 25 billion shillings. What does that tell us? Yes, we're going to do it, but how much is it going to cost us in terms of taxpayers' money? Are we willing to spend 25B plus another 18.5 billion?
It could be cheaper than corruption.
Don't they say democracy is expensive?
It's expensive, yes.
Yeah.
But it's going to be very expensive. And there's something else that we've been speaking about, what the the Deputy President said at Chatham House. And there's something interesting here he says. He says, the leader of the party which comes second becomes the leader of the opposition, of course, and with the running mate automatically become members of parliament and assume leadership of the opposition. And he proposes that the formula should also apply at the county level. He proposes that with the leader of opposition taking leadership of the opposition in parliament, as we had said, Deputy President should take over leadership of government business in parliament. And this should be replicated to deputy governors at the counties. And then the Senate must be made the upper house. The Senate must be made the upper house. And thirdly, cabinet secretaries should be ex-official members of parliament and must attend sittings of parliament at least once every week or wherever required.
But it was very directly opposed to members of parliament, members of cabinet being substantive members of parliament. But you can already see similarities between what he was saying, for example, and a few things that Moses Kuria, for example, has proposed, in, especially with regard to some people.
He's running for president.
Yes, yes. But there are some people who are going to automatically gain positions in parliament, even in Moses Kuria's formula. For example, he was saying that whoever is the runners-up in that election automatically becomes the leader of official opposition. That seems to ignore, in my view, how many MPs this person might have. Then he also had an idea of the running mate of that runner-up actually being a member of the Senate, for example. So there's a sense in which the Deputy President is also saying that there's automatic membership of parliament, whichever house, to the running mate here.
I saw Yvonne read what were the aspirations and the terms of reference for the Building Bridges initiative. One of them was divisive elections and the whole question of inclusivity. You see, the tragedy of our country currently is that regardless of how many votes you get and you become number two doesn't matter. And obviously, your supporters will feel left out, that they turned out, they voted for you, and Mwingizo uko forest, as we say, you have nothing. But probably, if you get the leader of official opposition, probably your supporters will feel you are somewhere, you are included somewhere. And this counting between guys who have won and guys who have lost will probably reduce. But ultimately, I think it's more about amending the constitution in our heads and our hearts rather than the text of it. Because there's some very interesting and very nice things in the constitution. But are they really followed? Is amending the constitution
allow me to add something about inclusivity. Yes, inclusivity, is it just about what happens during the election, or is it what happens between the election? Is it about equitable share of resources? Is it about everybody benefiting regardless of who wins or who is number two? I think the focus on the election as an event, which is what it is, but it's what happens between the 5 years that I think has a lot of people feeling marginalized and not included, and that there is lack of inclusivity, which are some of the things that we should be talking about. How much money should we retain at the national government? Should it be is it 85%? Or should we have a lot more going down to the counties? I think the question of inclusivity, I mean, on a personal level, I wouldn't care who number one or number two was, as long as the fuel prices are right, the cost of living is down. Like, I feel a part of, there's a sense of belonging.
And that would apply to most reasonable people. But there's something that the Deputy President actually said, which was quite interesting. He said that actually the problem we have is not the electoral system. It is actually the fact that certain people do not accept when they lose the elections. Linus Kaikai.
You have history to tell us now.
Joe, in 2007, and I don't know whether F. Mwangi can give us that clip. And Robert, if you do have, maybe you can have a look at this. Let's have a look at this. Yes, let's see KICC, and then we come back to this point.
Results that were announced here were just figures, computer printouts. It didn't have Form 16A, it didn't have Form 16, and therefore the figures that were announced here were just numbers assigned to candidates.
Joe, you spoke about politicians speaking according to where they sit at that particular time. That was 2007. That was William Ruto, who was then in ODM.
Rejecting the elections.
And rejecting the election results.
He had a very detailed thing about Molo and Juja.
He actually did, in a very quick way, the Supreme Court equivalent of the analysis of the failure of the electronic transmission in the 2017 election. And he went through it very, very quickly, spoke about Molo, spoke about Juja, and spoke about the famous Tharaka-Nithi. Yeah, and the questions he was raising that time was the relationship between the figures that were being announced at KICC and the figures that have been tallied or counted in Tharaka-Nithi and all those places. Remember, that question is yet to be answered to date. 2013, same questions are coming. Is what we are announcing exactly what was counted at the polling station? 2017, all the way to the Supreme Court. And the judges were asking, what are those?
And that mismatch between the number of people who vote for other positions and the number of people who vote for the president. Because that was quite clear in Molo and Juja at that time when he was speaking.
Which is why I feel every time politicians speak that way, then they are backing up the wrong tree. Because it doesn't, it's not biting them at that time. It bit them in 2007. Now it's not biting them. They're on the opposite side, so it's not an issue. I think electoral systems, and I think it's one of our topics tonight on IBC, is one of the key problems. Otherwise, and now we are talking about an expanded executive. You know what that means? Instead of questioning votes of one position, you'll end up questioning votes of about 5 positions. If people don't agree on the credibility, on a credible process of voting, tallying and counting those votes, then we'll be on the same spot like we've been for the last 15 years now.
And we need to move on. Gashuri, someone else has been making quite a number of statements, fruits and so on.
Oh yes, but before we go that, one step back.